Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today what we thought we'd do is give our new first impressions of the latest meta, because we did just get a brand new box release, the Requiem of Collapse, which did introduce a brand new type along with the character's yugioh, that being Dark Galaxy. But not only that, we also got some Psychic fusions, some Worm fusions, as well as a few other kind of new decks. I mean, they're kind of evolve existing decks, but they're functionally new decks because they do play on sort of a different axis. So the first thing we're going to do, like always, is go and take a look at tournament results, as this is what we usually base our tiers off of. So what we've been seeing is the decks that have been winning so far in this meta: Light Galaxy, 2 Dark Galaxy, 2 Metarion, and 1 Psychic Fusion, which means these are definitely the decks to beat. Now, Light Galaxy did get a tournament win, but we should also note this was during the first day that the box had released. This was the very first tournament, so maybe we shouldn't give it too much credit for that, because it might just be right place, right time. People haven't really adapted to the new cards yet. People are very experimental with their builds. And if we take a look over in our table, we can see that it has only had one top 4 representation over the last week, and that was the time it won. So it doesn't seem like it's very consistent at the very least. Dark Galaxy, however, definitely is the front runner. Metarion is also performing quite well, only just behind it. So Dark Galaxy and Metarion do seem to be the best decks. We have a little bit of a drop down to get to Psychic Fusion, but not too big of a gap. Then there's Light Galaxy, Cyber Dragon, Worm Fusion, and Dragon Fusion all bringing up the rear, and no other deck has actually managed to find a top 8 finish. So let's hop in and start tiering some of these decks, and the first one is going to be Dark Galaxy, and this is going straight into tier 1, and I think it makes sense why. Dark Galaxy is just one of the strongest decks right now statistically. It has won the most tournaments, being tied at 2. It has the highest representation, and it has been performing the best overall in top 8 and in top 4. This deck is quite easy to play. It is basically just keep spamming out monsters onto the board as much as you can, put them all in attack mode, give as many of them piercing as you can, and ram into your opponent's board again and again and again until you win. The reason this works so well is because the deck has a lot of ways to gain advantage. The skill will almost always give you a +1 every single turn. Cataphract is a really good card again. It will almost always put a boss monster from your graveyard into your hand for another 3+1. Then we have cards like Globule, which can effectively discount something out of boss monster, which is sort of like a 3+1. With this many ways to just gain advantage or discount summon monsters, you're able to just build boards very, very quickly and very, very efficiently. You also have ways to put cards back into your deck between things like Pot of Avarice and Globule, so even though we're milling a lot of cards, we typically will get a lot of that back into our deck, and we shouldn't be decking out too often. With this deck's ability to just build boards very easily, summon out big attack monsters, and then have a lot of piercing between Star Trancer, which can give one of your bosses piercing, and our skill, which can give one of our vanillas piercing, this deck is able to chunk through for quite a sizable amount of damage, and it's no wonder it has been performing so well. Next up, we're going to talk about Blaster's Inferno, and this deck is a bit of a weird one. This deck for the longest time was considered a bit of a meme, but with the release of Go Rush and Secret Order, this deck had some new life into it. So the gimmick of this deck is your ability to activate Dragonic Pressure, discard 3 dragons, wipe the entire board. Then we can use Secret Order to bring back our Volcano Attack Dragon as a 3000 attack point monster. Then if we use our skill, we can then give our dragon an extra boost, as well as search back row hate to pop our opponent's back row. We're able to do that one more time, so if we have 2 Secret Order, or if we're able to normal summon 2 other dragons from our hand, we can quite easily OTK. So this is a deck that quite easily can swarm the board, quite easily can wipe the board, and can be very, very explosive. Now, the reason this is down in tier 3 is because although this deck has been performing okay, it hasn't been overperforming compared to any of the other decks, especially not since the new box came out. But the main issue this deck has is that the skill doesn't actually help you with any of the key combo pieces. It doesn't help us get access to our Volcano Attack Dragon, it doesn't help us gain access to our Secret Order, and it doesn't help us gain access to our Dragonic Pressure. Since those 3 cards can't be searched, we do just have to naturally draw into them, which can make this deck feel a little bit inconsistent. Next up, we have Cyber Dragon, and Cyber Dragon, I think, is going to go into tier 2. Cyber Dragon is a strong deck. It is still a powerful deck. Even in this meta, it has been performing reasonably well. Even just today, it got second place in a tournament. So we have to give it props where it's due. Now, this deck has felt a little bit underwhelming as of late. This is definitely an absolute terror on the ladder, and especially on ladder, is performing exceedingly well, but in actual tournament play and in point battles, this deck has been underperforming a little bit. Now, this deck does have one thing going for it, and that is, it is very consistent, and it's very good at putting 3 decent sized bodies on the board, whether that's attack or defense. And because of that, it can beat up the Galaxy decks quite a lot. This deck actually has pretty good matchups into both Light and Dark Galaxy, which is something you can't really take away from it because, again, we're not really summoning small bodies, and therefore we're not getting pierced over for a ridiculous amount. This deck also can run Ancient Gear Golem, which is just an insanely good card, probably one of the best individual cards in the entire game, and having easy access to Cyber Twin when we combine those 2 cards together can be a bit of a nightmare. So Tier 2, still solid, but not really in that Tier 1 or Tier 1.5 contention. And next up, we have Machine Good Stuff. This is going somewhere around here. I'm not sure where exactly in Tier 3, but this feels about right. So Machine Good Stuff is basically using the Join Tech skill to stick some low-level Machine Earth monsters in the graveyard, to use them as fuel for all of the machine effects that require you to shuffle cards from your graveyard back into your deck. This is things like Join Tech Rex, Mirror Innovator, Bicorn, those sort of cards. It's another really good deck that can take advantage of Ancient Gear Golem, and this deck just aims to pop your opponent's back row to get a load of big piercing guys and ram through your opponent. This is also a good stuff list, so it's kind of an amalgamation of different stuff. Obviously, it's still a machine deck, but it's not the light machines, it's not the cyber dragons, it's not the Join Tech. It's kind of a mixture of all 3. And because of that, it's not really skill reliant. You could realistically play this deck without a skill, and that does make it a little bit scary. But this deck feels like it does have to high roll a little bit because, again, the skill is doing so little for the deck that it really has to play catch up with the stronger decks. This is still a very strong deck. This deck still could actually win a tournament, but for right now, I don't think I could put this higher than Tier 3. Next up, we have Spellcaster Fusion, and I think this has to go in Rogue. So Spellcaster Fusion is not a bad deck, and I don't want people to think that Rogue means bad. Rogue means it has some matchups that it's quite good against, but realistically, I would not expect to see this top 8. So this deck is still pretty good. We're still able to make a giant monster that can go up to over 5,000 attack. The skill does make this deck relatively consistent as well. And we do still get the ability to put piercing on our 7's Rogue Witch. This deck actually has quite a lot going for it, and 7's Paladin itself is a fantastic boss monster. The only issue is this deck can really struggle to beat set 3 monsters. We either have to rely on Witch's Piercing, which is only really relevant if your opponent is playing very, very low defense monsters, and because of both of the Galaxy decks, there's a lot of piercing going around, which means people are playing as high defense monsters as they possibly can, which means the effectiveness of the Piercing of Witch is very diminished. The only other way we can really get piercing damage through is going to be with the Thunder Gazelle, and that is very unreliable because your opponent has to have no cards in their hand in order to get that boost off. So although this deck has a lot of potential and with a few new good cards could really surge into the meta, right now it's not seeing itself in a particularly great spot, and I think its results do reflect that. And next up we have Light Galaxy. This is going straight into Tier 2. So Light Galaxy is a deck that was one of the strongest decks in the game. In fact, before the latest product came out, people were arguing this was the second best deck in the game. And this deck is very powerful. It is the best deck to make use of Secret Order. We're able to use Meteor Charge to change our opponent's battle positions and give our monsters piercing, which effectively let us get like a double piercing style of effect off, which is really, really strong. As well as the fact you can build a board very, very easily because the skill will just send one of our high-level monsters to the graveyard, then get us a search, and then we can just activate a spell card that we've searched in order to bring it back. So it's effectively a completely free boss monster, which is absolutely insane value. The downside of this deck is that once you do run out of your spell cards, it does kind of stall out. The deck just becomes vanilla beatdown, which is not particularly impressive. The deck is still very good, and if you do find a very good hand early, you can still end games exceedingly quickly, but it has fallen from grace a little bit as we've gotten more decks that can build big boards, and that really does punish the Light Galaxy deck from doing what it really wants to do. Next up, we have Dragon Fusion, and Dragon Fusion is still a decent deck. Now, its tournament results haven't been stellar, but it has had a top 8 finish recently, and this deck is still not that bad. In point battles, this deck does perform reasonably well, and in tournaments, it has done okay, if not anywhere near as good as the decks above it. But this deck basically works to turbo out the Dragius Star F, create a big double attacking monster that's either 3900 that double attacks or 3000 that can double attack and pierce, and can be a bit of a menace. Now, this deck still can be a bit wonky into cards in the current meta. If we don't find our bosses and we don't get our whole combo going particularly quickly, we can get beaten up by a lot of these big, strong piercing decks. But if we are able to find our Dragius early, if we're able to use our skill to get our Star Dragon and our fusion and then make our big boss monster, this deck can close out games relatively quickly. Again, I would say this is probably the weakest tier 2 deck, but I do think this deck still does deserve to be in tier 2. And next up we have Warrior Fusion, and Warrior Fusion is in an interesting spot. So Yamiterasu is actually a bit of a weird boss monster right now because we do have a lot more tools that can just deal with it. So it's not a crazy good card right now, but it still does have its uses, such as against Dark and Light Galaxy, they have to special summon their monsters in defense mode, which can be quite detrimental to those very aggressive decks. But Kime Luna and Kime Terasu are still really, really strong. Those cards still do have a very relevant place in the meta, and although this deck has fallen down a little bit because the decks that it was doing particularly well against are now not doing as well themselves, it still is relevant to the meta, it's just fallen from grace a little bit. Realistically, I think this deck is still decently strong, it's just going to struggle against some of the tier 1 and tier 1.5 decks. Next up we have Elemental Heroes, and this is again going to go straight into Rogue. Elemental Heroes has found itself in a bit of a weird spot for a long time. It is a warrior based deck, which means Metarion, which has been the top dog, has always had a really good matchup into it. We started seeing Elemental Hero players specifically play anti-Metarion techs, just so they don't auto lose that matchup, and it has worked okay for those players, but overall the deck has really struggled to really get anything going. The deck, if it draws the God Hand and if your opponent gets a little bit unlucky, can have very, very impressive duels, but those are very few and far between. A lot of the time you are going to be relying on things like Talismanic Seal Array. You do still have to find all the pieces for your fusion, even though it can be easier than some other decks to get the fusion out. Realistically, this deck just has too few things going for it right now, but with a bit more support in the future, I could see this deck really catapulting into the meta. As for right now, I think Rogue is a good spot for it. It still does have some matchups it does excel at, but overall, a little bit underwhelming. Next up, we have Metarion, and Metarion, arguably still the best deck. I think there is an argument there. This deck is still very, very strong. We can still use Type Change Beam to OTK our opponent. We're still able to very easily make multiple fusion monsters in a turn. We're able to use Victory Star to change monsters to attack or flip them face down. We can use Assura Star to pop face down cards or just gain a crap load of attack. We can spin our opponent's board away using Hercules. This deck just does so much. And with the ability to send Monster Reincarnation to the graveyard, the deck basically has like a free Pot of Greed built in, but it's even better than Pot of Greed because Pot of Greed would lose itself and then we'd gain 2, whereas Imaginary Reactor sticks around and still gives us the +2. Not to mention, if we find Monster Reincarnation early, we can activate it, then use Reactor, put it back, draw 2, then summon out another Reactor, use the skill, send it to graveyard, put it back into our deck, draw another 2, so it just gives you absolutely insane value. But this deck is, unless it gets a big hit, I don't think this deck is ever going to not be relevant, or unless the power creep gets really, really crazy. But right now we have been seeing Dark Galaxy being a good foil to the Metarion deck, just because it is so aggressive, it can get in so much damage through set 3 pass. But even saying all of that, Metarion has still won the most tournaments this format, and last format was so unbelievably dominant, unless a nerf does come in, realistically this deck isn't going anywhere. Next up we have Cyburst, and we're going to put Cyburst in the bottom of Rogue. This deck still can play. The deck is still okay, it still has good advantage engines. Chaos Femtron is still a really good card, so is Atrashoot Hydron. The maximum still can be a bit of a problem for a lot of decks. But the deck does have extremely low defense, which means Light Galaxy specifically gets to absolutely devour it. There are a lot of decks right now that can just beat Cyburst up, which does put it in a bit of a weird spot. But if you draw well enough, the deck still does what Cyberse has always done, gain a lot of advantage, easily get out boss monsters, reduce your opponent's board, and get in for a lot of damage. I do think, again, Rogue does feel right for this deck because a lot of other decks basically do what Cyberse has always done, but they do it a little bit easier than Cyberse does now. So it does make Cyberse feel a little bit weaker by comparison, but this deck is still very playable, and I think still deserves to be on the list. Next up, we have Worm Fusion, and I'm not sure where in Tier 2 this is going to go. This might go towards the bottom of Tier 2, but for right now, we're going to put it at the top of Tier 2. Worm Fusion is a bit of a weird deck. This deck does have multiple different builds. There is the Secret Order build going around, and there is kind of the regular Tarrasque build, I suppose, going around. Secret Order does seem to be the way to play it. So far, the Secret Order builds have been outperforming the non-Secret Order builds, and this deck is reasonably good. So this deck's main claim to fame is, again, being able to build a very big board very, very easily. We're able to, for example, get out a Bill Dragon, use Bill Dragon's effect to bring back Drake Crush, then use a Secret Order, bring back another Drake Crush. With the field spell out, you now have a 29, 28, and 28, which is just a massive board, and not many decks can easily out that. Now, decks can out that. That's not an unbreakable board or anything, but some decks will really struggle, and even the decks that can quite easily out it do need specific hands in order to do so. Now, there are still some decks that will absolutely punish this. Metarion is one, Psychic Fusion is another. There are just some of these decks that can do that sort of thing. But Dark Galaxy, Light Galaxy, Cyber Dragon, all of these very high-tiered decks are going to really struggle to break that board super, super easily, which does mean this deck can get a bit sticky. Now, you do have to rely on the Fusion in order to actually beat set 3 pass, because if we don't get the Fusion out, we're just going to be basically attack, 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 pass, attack, 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 pass. So we do have to make sure we get that Fusion onto the field, because then we can pop 2 monsters out of the way and get in for damage that way. Other than that, this deck doesn't actually have that many weaknesses. I suppose you could argue there are a lot of unsearchable cards in the deck. We do want to get Drake Crush into the graveyard as soon as possible. We can't force it there. We just have to naturally draw into it and then get it into the graveyard. Other than that bit of inconsistency and the fact the deck can feel a little bit slow, just because we have to use our skill to get our Fusion, and we have to use our skill to get our field spell, and we want to do both in the same turn, but we typically can't, so we have to rely on other cards to kind of do that for us. I still think this deck is reasonably strong. It has had a top 4 finish, and it's had multiple top 8 finishes, so Tier 2 feels right to me. And speaking of worms, now we're going to talk about Worm Maximum. So this is a deck that was running around during the last format, and did actually get a 2nd place finish. I think it had another top 4 finish and some top 8 finishes. This deck is still reasonably good. People were playing this as a bit of a counter pick to that meta. This meta is a little bit different, so it's going to be not exactly the same, but the deck is still reasonable. The basic strategy of the deck is that we turbo out our Worm Excavator. We use 3 copies of Restoration so we can keep drawing cards, which will also refill our hand to give our monster an even bigger buff, and then basically try and win off the back of Excavator itself. Using the skill, we can get it Piercing. Using its own effect, we can pop back row, and this card is kind of a 1 card, well, I suppose like all Maximum decks, it's a 1 card, try to win the game off of that 1 card, similarly to how Yggdrago works. Again, it's a little bit weaker now than it was, but the deck can still perform, and thus I think Rogue is the right place for it. Then we have Psychic, and this is specifically the old Psychic using the old Psychic skill. This deck is still okay. Realistically, this deck is not going to be winning any tournaments, but this deck could still top. We are still able to use the skill to get incredible value, being able to basically get 2 pluses off of the skill, being able to use Melody's effect on our level 4 or lowest to put back into our hand to spin our opponent's board is really, really strong. Even though there is undoubtedly a better way to play Psychic, this deck in its original form is still very, very strong. And again, I could see this topping, if maybe not winning. And I suppose we'll talk about Psychic Fusion now. This is going straight into tier 1.5. So this could have been at the top of tier 2 or the bottom of tier 1, but it didn't really feel right going in either. I feel like it is noticeably weaker than Metarion and Dark Galaxy, but it is noticeably stronger than Worms, Cyber Dragons, Galaxy, etc. So this deck is pretty cool, but you are very piece reliant because of how the skill works. There are 3 cards that we can search, which one of them sort of gets you to a piece of the fusion, but doesn't really. You kind of have to go through multiple steps or draw into it beforehand, which we'll talk about the Ice Pot Bear. But being able to dump a load of stuff into the graveyard can be really nice for this deck. So the basic strategy of this deck is that we're going to try and turbo out our fusion, Candy Live, use its effect to get a Prima Katana that ideally we've put into the graveyard using our skill, and then just every turn try and do that again and again and again. So the logic is we'll gain 1,000 life points by using Candy Live, bring back our Prima, and then basically not use Prima's effect unless we're going to go in for like big lethal or get a big chunk of damage in. And basically just keep doing that. We just keep gaining life points. Because every time we make our fusion, we're also going to gain an extra 800 life from Psychic Upper's effect. Just keep gaining. Then we don't mind if our ball gets broken. We'll take some damage. We shouldn't take like game-ending damage. And then we just try and do it again. The way we get to do it again is just by drawing into them, using our skill to search the cards we don't have, or using Star Restart again to get some of the cards back. And then we just do this again and again and again until we're ready to end the game. Now, this deck can be quite scary because if we're able to get out a Prima and a Candy Live, and we still have Live's effect on, if our opponent has 2 monsters in attack mode, we can activate our effect to reduce our opponent's monster's attack down to 0. Then we can use Prima's effect to boost both of our monsters' attack by 600. So that means Prima would go up to 28, and Candy Live would go up to 34, and 28 plus 34, 62. That is lethal, and all your opponent has to do is have 2 attack position monsters. So this deck can be very, very scary, but like we say, we are very piece reliant. If we don't draw the hands that we need to draw, unfortunately this deck can stall out and not really get anything going, but that should be very few and far between. We have seen a lot of experimentation with builds for this deck, and I think over the next week we'll probably start to solidify what is the best build, but I think it's unquestionable that this deck has been performing reasonably well and has already got its first tournament win. Right, the last decks we're going to talk about are all going into meme tiers. So first one is going to be Thunder Fusion, and Thunder Fusion, this deck is okay. It's nothing like crazy. Realistically, you can win with this deck. You could maybe even top with this deck. I don't think it would go higher than top 8 realistically, and even that might be a bit of a push. Poseidon itself is an okay boss monster. It's not too much of a heavy investment to get it out. Its effect is fine, but it's nothing crazy. It's not going to do anything unfair. It's rather underwhelming. The other fusion monster they got, I'm not a big fan personally. It does seem kind of weak. It's high investment for not much return. It's also very restrictive in how you can use it. I think the rest of the Thunder deck really needs a bit of an update, and without getting any new Thunder cards other than these fusions, it doesn't really feel that great. Like I said, the deck can still win, the deck can still do okay, but it's not realistically going to be winning a tournament anytime soon. And the next deck we'll talk about is Insects and Ant Rebellion of the Rebellion. This deck, again, can win. You can get a board out that can potentially OTK your opponent. If they leave everything in attack, they have no trap cards that can stop you, and basically don't play around it at all, and you get very, very lucky and invest a lot into it, you can do these silly OTK plays. But realistically, again, that's not going to win the game, right? That's not going to win a tournament. This deck could be kind of fun to do like a weird challenge run with, but realistically, Ants are not going to be winning anything. And then finally, we have Amnesia. And Amnesia, this deck is also a bit of a weird one. The skill is not very good. The deck in general can, if you get lucky, do quite a lot. This deck is going to rely on unsearchable Meteor Charge to really get a lot of damage in. The boards it makes aren't too impressive because your guys are never going to have a big load of attack. Realistically, this is going in meme with these other decks. It would be really cool if we could see one of these 3 decks really shine and someone actually perform very, very well at a tournament with them. But until then, they're going to be locked into the meme tier. So this is the list. Now, again, we could move some of this around a bit. Like maybe some people would have Metarian above Dark Galaxy. We could move Galaxy and Cyber Dragon and Worm around. But realistically, I don't think that matters too much. What matters is the actual tier that they're in general. I think it goes without saying that Dark Galaxy and Metarian are the best decks, followed by Psychic Fusion. I think then we get to like the other top performing decks, that being Worm, Light Galaxy, Cyber Dragon, and Dragon Fusion. And then everything else underneath, I think potentially tier 3 and Rogue could top, I don't expect them to get to top 4, and I especially don't expect them to win a tournament, but we could see them hitting top 8. But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.